Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. In today's episode, I wanted to come on and talk to you guys about grief. I am currently in a season of my life where I'm transitioning. And when I say transitioning, for me, it's more so like becoming a woman. No longer being a child, no longer being a young adult, rather, but actually really matriculating into adulthood. And I want to talk about this grief because as I'm going through this and I am holding space like a mental memoriam for all of the dreams that were deferred, I believe that I can help some of you guys, especially if you're African American, make this transition as well. So, as we know, that adolescent regression is very prevalent in our community. You can see this very easily with the content that goes viral. You can very see this with the entertainment industry, and where there's a greater audience. A lot of people kind of flock to that audience, right? The Shade Room is a prime example. So we know that we have a very unhealthy relationship with entertainment and how it really persists within our community. But we also understand that we understand the reasons why, right? We understand the reasons why. Public education is not something that really prioritizes any type of investment into young Black kids, into underserved communities, right? So a lot of times you're not even really taught the prioritization of education. And seeing so many people having a desire to be in corporate America today is so interesting to me. I think it really speaks to the realities that this blue collar kind of like life is very common for the vast majority of us. And it really speaks to the obsessions that we have with exceptionalism and how this does contribute to a little bit of that collective grief. So I'm going to take a sip of my coffee and we're going to go ahead and get into this video. So something that I was thinking about today at the park, I was grieving having these really big dreams. I looked back over old photos of myself as a young girl and I was like, oh my God, I was so fabulous. I was so beautiful. And I didn't even know it. I was so insecure. There were a lot of times where I didn't take opportunities because I didn't feel smart enough. I didn't feel beautiful enough, for the guys that I actually wanted to date, the guys that I thought were attractive. You know what I mean? I just really lived in a perpetual state of not enoughness. Like it just was really hard feeling, like I could do anything, like I was capable of anything. I wasted a lot of time in just rumination and procrastination. On top of that, I didn't feel as though I really had a foundation to kind of jumpstart my pre-adulthood, if you will, right? I was busy collecting the pieces and doing a lot of that work to kind of like overcome some of the childhood trauma, overcome some of the bullying and the experiences that were happening even as a young woman. That was a lot to navigate, on top of, trying to take advantage of my youth, right? And take advantage of the opportunities that were in front of me and the resources that were in front of me. Looking back, I think that would have been a bit unrealistic to expect from someone who was going through what it was that I was going through. Like, it just wasn't possible. And so yeah, but I was thinking about how I just always had these really big dreams. Right now, I put this red lipstick on, today and everything. And I was like, I look like a teacher. And when I think about, who I was as a young adult and the environment that I grew up around, it's like, what did I want to be when I got older? What did I want to do with my life as a young adult? Like, what was it that I was really into? And I can't say that I had these really big, bodacious dreams, right? It wasn't really until I started getting on Tumblr. If you don't know, Tumblr was a blogging site back in the day. You were able to kind of see what the girls were up to in LA. That really brought about a different level of aspiration, on top of it being encouraged by one of my parental figures. But it was unfortunate, and I talked about this on TikTok, the realities of projecting these very big dreams and something kind of like exceptionalism. We'll say America's exceptionalism, right? Fame, et cetera, et cetera. It's unfortunate when you project those things onto your children, but you don't actually give them any resources, or you invest in them and the things that they're good at that could actually help them get to that level of aspiration. And so looking back, I think that it was encouraged for me to dream big. It was encouraged for me to know that I could have more than what was in front of me. And I think the intention was to say, hey, you don't have to be like the environment around you. But in the long haul, or maybe even just kind of like underneath all of it, I think it really did me a disservice because instead of, you know, pursuing the things I was good at, right? I wanted to go to school. I wanted to be a journalist. Instead of doing that, instead of looking at local news stations, my head was so far over there, right? My focus was over there. I didn't even engage with a lot of my peers because I felt like I didn't want to take a chance and partner with the wrong person or, because in my mind, I was headed over there, right? The sky was the limit and I lived in the clouds. And I think that that's really what we kind of have today, right? Instead of these young kids interacting with one another, instead of them going to get their first apartment, that is absolutely nothing close to fabulous, right? Nothing close to luxury. They are at home and they are encouraged to kind of like engage with people online in other cities, and they are afraid to take risk and they're afraid to interact with the people around them, right? To even create any sense of like personal satisfaction and life happiness, right? Because for me, it's like looking back, if you're always in the clouds, if you're always looking 10 steps ahead, if you're always kind of chasing these very big dreams, not only are you going to be utterly disappointed when it doesn't come to pass, which I believe this is the dream deferred, and this is something that is very common within our community, but you also are going to find yourself missing out on everything that's in front of you. I think about who I could be and the people I've met along the way and the friendships I could have had I been a little bit more focused, been a little bit more intentional and present. But I was so busy chasing after this version of exceptionalism, and I never went after it because it was always so overwhelming, right? I mean, you got to think about it. Most of us are coming from underserved communities, okay? And I've had people come online and they say things like, "Not every Black person is poor." Yeah, I don't feel like we have to address that here. Like that's just like a no-brainer. But yeah, and so I just think about that and how different my life could have been had I been a little bit more eyes wide open. And I'm just seeing that happen for a lot of our younger generations. And it wasn't until my later 20s that I started to realize how unrealistic these dreams really were. And it wasn't to say, and I'll get to this, right? Because this isn't to say that you shouldn't aspire to have more. This isn't to say you shouldn't try. This isn't to say that you shouldn't go after what it is that you want. But it is to say that the things that we often desire come with a insurmountable amount of privilege that many of us do not have, right? The athletes, the people that we admire the most are people who have been primed and prepped and ready, right? They are not people who come from, maybe it's not the best circumstance. Of course, we all have our own thing. Do you understand what I'm saying? But, you know, there's privilege there, right? There's someone who is actually investing in them so that they can get this desired outcome. And that investment typically starts very early on. So this is why I kind of take it back to the disservice that we do our children when we, buy our seventh graders Alexander McQueen sneakers. I've actually seen this. And we are cashing out on Teslas and things like that at prom, right? Because what you're doing is you're setting this child up for a lifetime of disappointment. And when I think about the underachievement that then takes place in the latter years for a lot of young adults, especially African-American adults, men and women, what you kind of see is just, there's not really any momentum because you don't really have like a grasp on reality, right? And you're kind of stuck because what you're aspiring to have comes with so much hard work, right? And typically if you are not one of the privileged ones who has had someone who invests in you to that degree, you're going to be behind the curve. And I think you're aware of that. And so I think what happens for a lot of us is like, we just kind of become complacent. And I think this is also where you start to have addictions, right? You're already in an impoverished community or in underserved communities. And when I say impoverished, I don't always mean materialistically. I think that this communal grief that I'm speaking to is something that kind of perpetuates and it permeates the psychology of a lot of the individuals around us. And I think that grief is something that is then projected out into our social spaces, right? Even if you're at grandmama's house, you know what I mean? Even if you're hanging out in your own home with your relatives, right? Like that collective grief is very discouraging. And I think it's a thing that lingers. And that's the thing that shows up in the addictions, in the, yes, weed smoke is an addiction. I'm saying it. in the addictions and in the drug use and the substance abuse and all these different things. And so it kind of becomes a perpetual cycle, because you have to understand, grief is the thing that makes us want to numb ourselves, right? Like when you think about people who are struggling with alcoholism or even just, substance abuse, right? Like, why do you think that is, right? They are simply trying to numb something. And I think sometimes we think of this as like, okay, this person's had a hard life or a childhood. No, but a lot of times it could be the lack of personal fulfillment that this person feels for a lack of achievement in their lives. And it never had to be that way. Right. So when I talk about my personal experience, do I think I would have probably been a little bit more satisfied had I never been inflicted in those images of like, this exceptionalism, this very, glamorous life, had it never been inflicted on me? Yes, I do. I think I would have a lot more fulfillment. I think I would have had a lot more fulfillment. I would have actually pursued the things that I was good at, the things that were very practical, very grounding, things that made a lot more sense, right? I wouldn't have turned my nose up at the local news station and felt like, no, I want to be on CNN, right? I need to go to X, Y, and Z, or I need to go and do X, Y, and Z. I would have been a lot more practical in pursuing my goals. I would have been a lot more practical, and even just the friends that I choose to hang out with, right? I wouldn't have been so critical of them, feeling like, oh, I have to get from around these people because they don't have X, right? They don't have Y. They don't possess. And when we say X and Y, I understand too, I'm not always talking materialism. Sometimes I'm talking about psychology, right? There was a mindset that kind of started to permeate. I don't want to say permeate, but it started to dominate internet spaces. And it was like, get from around people who don't X, Y, and Z, and they don't X, Y, and Z, but really the X, Y, and Z in comparison, in contrast, was they don't possess exceptionalism, right? And so that's why you have today where a lot of people want to be around you if you have something, right? It's not necessarily just a matter of being a mooch or a leech, some people are parasitic, but a lot of times it's really just because of the perspectives that have now been so deeply ingrained in our brains. And this is what it is that we desire, right? We seek exceptionalism because it is actually the thing that will grant you social capital, right? Social access. I mean, you can't sit here and say that these content creators, these influencers who have been online for a few years, and they're able to buy homes and they have friends and they have lunches at these beautiful spaces. Like, you can't say that doesn't have an impact on you. I think collectively we are aware that, to have capital is to have access. And so I don't always think it's a bad thing, but I do think that for a lot of people, we lose touch with reality. We lose touch with ourselves, and we look up when we fall so short of this exceptionalism that we ultimately end up spending our life in a perpetual state of grievance. Now, for me, how I'm moving through this grief is acknowledging it. I think the biggest thing for me is to acknowledge the grief. I would also say, as I acknowledge it, I do hold a memorable memorial service for the grief, but I also don't stay in a perpetual state of grief, if that makes sense. Like, me personally, I think it's more so like, okay, this happened. This happened in my life. I do grieve that. I do grieve not taking advantage of my youth, of the opportunities that were in front of me, of the beauty, you know what I mean? All these different things. But at the same time, I personally am rooted in reality. Hold on. One moment, please. So I'm rooted in reality. I understand that youth does not last forever. I'm at a place of personal acceptance, right? There actually does come a point in time where you have to grow up, and it looks different for everybody. I am in the real world. So my markers as far as like growing up and getting older and what adulthood looks like may look different for someone else. I know that we are also in a state in society where, mentally we feel like, hey, there are no markers to adulthood, right? I mean, it can happen at any age, any stage. And I think that creates a sense of lostness and irresponsibility that is, again, perpetual. And I think that does have a huge impact on the Black community, right? Because me personally, I actually do think that you should be at a certain point, at a certain age in your life, and you should have certain things established. I mean, it's not always materialistically, as I always state. I just think materials and externals are things that, unfortunately, you can't control. You can't really control whether or not the business takes off, or whether or not you There's just certain things you can't control, you know what I mean? But there are certain things that I do think that we should start to prioritize as we get older. And I think stability is one of them. So yes, I do think you should actually be at a certain point in your life when you get older. But I also just understand that, like, everyone's in a different space and time. And I guess something I could say to young people, if you're watching this and you're like in your early 20s, I would say really spend that time with yourself. I think the best advice my mother ever gave me, which I didn't take, of course, would be to spend time getting to know you. Have your friends. Spend time getting to know you, though, because it's one of those things to where it's just like, I don't know, you don't really get that time back. And I think it's a very unfortunate thing to be in your late 30s, and you're still on this journey of self-discovery. I understand from the Western psychological sense, right? Self-discovery is perpetual. It's consistent, rather. But I also understand that there are, you want to have a firm foundation. You don't want to spend your entire life wondering what you like, you know what I mean, and who you are, and you know what I mean. I think that should be something that you lay the groundwork for in your 20s, just because I just think that would just, I don't know, I just kind of, it's hard to maneuver and enjoy life if you don't ever really know yourself, so that's the best advice I would give. But yeah, so moving through the grief, it's acknowledging the grief. And after you process that acceptance, it's dreaming again, right? It's revising the dream, right? What does that look like now that you're older, that you're an adult? What does that look like, right? Because it doesn't look the same, right? I realized for me, I actually prioritize more secluded, and when I say secluded, I mean like, to myself more so, spaces. I no longer really enjoy the loudness and the absurdity and the trash and all these different things, and even all the people, the commotion of the city. Before, when I was young, I was a city girl. I was like, oh my God, I have to be in the city. I love the city, et cetera, et cetera. I've gotten older. I prioritize my health. You know what I mean? So I got to have walking areas near me. I also, enjoy cooking at home, So it looks different. It looks different. And even before, when I first started writing, I mean, it was like, hey, what's up? This is what I ate for breakfast today. Then it kind of, went into poetry, and now here I am, and it's like I'm teaching, So stick with it, stick with whatever the dream is, but accept that it doesn't look how you thought it was going to look, and it may never look the way you think it's going to look, but it's okay. And then the last thing I would say is find purpose. Sometimes we don't get the outcomes that we want in life, not because we're not worthy, not because we didn't even try hard enough, but because sometimes that's just the reality of life. That's the reality of life. You get older, and again, like I said, you start to realize that in order to have a certain outcome, you have to have a certain input. And I don't care what anybody says, nobody is self-made. I can water this plant every day. You know what I mean? I can do, but it takes so much more to really become a little bit more than what you are, essentially. So acknowledge that you've done your best, and work on giving that to someone else. I think that's another thing, like, finding purpose in teaching young adults. I mean, we can never really have too much of that in our community, right? We need mentors. So yeah, I think it's giving back in those ways, give back to the younger generations who don't have any of those things, or maybe, kids who are also looking for, what you didn't have, you know what I mean? Like, be that for someone else, and share the things that you've learned. Start a YouTube channel, you know what I mean? So I think that's kind of what it looks like. And then you just get older, you just learn to find gratitude in your life. But I think it's okay to grieve, I really do. And I think if you would grieve it, and you would start to kind of disassociate from messages that say, because you didn't achieve this, then you're not worthy, or you didn't work hard enough, or whatever the case may be. Because I think a lot of times the motivational content creators, right, and motivational speakers can typically they want to put that responsibility on you, but it's a lot more, it's deeper than that, So that's what I would say. But acknowledge the grief. I think if we would learn to grieve properly, if we would learn to give articulation to the grief and allow those really hard feelings, those disappointments and things like that to pass, I think we can make room for something healthy, something a lot more healthy. You don't have to hold grief. You don't have to feel ashamed for grief,